listening to a discussion between Orval and Trey from Telos Bound about the relationship between subject-object dynamics and evil. And Orval said something to the effect of evil essentially, well, he described 3 routes to hell, and the third route that he described is the one of interest for this video, which will be a quick video. That being that the route to hell could be the subject or the soul or the monads, essentially immersion in the objective world, over-immersion, over-saturation in the object. Orval was more oriented towards classical sins, which of course would fit this, like overindulgence in pleasure and whatnot, and specifically how your soul would be treating other souls in order to overindulge. Perhaps greed would be the best way to understand that and like relate that, because it usually happens at other people's expense. Of course, lust could as well, and everything else, wrath. And he routes that to essentially you culturing an experience of reality wherein, because you've developed that as a kind of normal way to treat people, you are subject to the exact same thing. So you have a kind of recursion. This actually kind of reminds me of some things Chris Langan has said that are pretty similar, and of course it's also similar to things I say. I did post a video on subject-object dynamics, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about what I believe is a very concrete relationship between the object and evil. I don't think evil is a principal thing, of course. It's not RK. I agree with Proclus on his disagreement with Plotinus. But I don't think that objectivity is evil. I think that object orientation is evil. I've wrote about this a little bit, but I figured it'd be good to make a video about it. Trey talked about a kind of splitting between the objective nature of the soul as it truly is, and the subjective nature of the soul as it wills itself to be. I would take a bit of a different approach, and that approach would be that it's not actually a splitting. It'd be a similar effect, so I'm not gonna criticize it too much, but it's actually the opposite. It's not a splitting, but it is over-identification of the subject as the object, right? So it's not only object orientation, which what I mean by when I say that is that the subject would be oriented onto its object. And let me clarify that if you haven't seen my subject-object video, I highly recommend it. But object orientation basically just means the soul's consciousness is always oriented on externality, right? It's always on the external manifest world, and it is quite ignorant of the inner subjective world, the ground of being, which would ultimately, as Eric kind of suggests, be the one. So, back to what Trey said, if the subject over-identified as the object, actually, I don't want to get too tangential, but it's not only orientation, but saturation and kind of immersion. Let's say that a subject is totally immersed in the world, and you're so immersed in the kind of phantasmal image of being that you kind of are ignorant of what underlies being, which is the subject. I would posit, just like Eric does, the subject is essentially unity, or the absolute. Now, if you're a subject who's just totally ignorant of subjectivity, maybe you even reify any anything subjective into kind of an objective process, as materialism basically does. And or maybe you're just over immersed in the object and you just kind of ignore the subject. I would say instead of a splitting, you actually have a fusion of the subject as the object. Of course, I'm kind of using the terms a little bit differently. Trey's using the terms subject-object. He uses it partly the same way, partly as in what you are objectively and what you are subjectively, whereas I think that's kind of it's a use of the terms that is derived, not necessarily derivative, but in this context it's a little bit derivative. But I'm using the context of subject as soul, object as basically the manifestation of the soul, the objectification of it. So of course I think that objectification is ultimately self-objectification. But yeah, I would say that evil is quite simply not to reify it and make it more than it actually is, make it even a principle, but it's really just the subject's identification of itself as the object. Its object orientation is caused by object orientation. I wouldn't say that all object orientation is evil or bad, because I think self-objectification is a natural process, and I don't think that the object is as an ontological procession of subjectivity, like I think souls are, or any particular subject as an ontological procession from the universal subject. But that being said, that's my view on subject-object. Recap, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but the soul's kind of ignorance of itself, it's kind of a... Trey does kind of talk about, he doesn't say it, but the way he describes it would kind of suggest that hell would be a kind of ungroundedness. And of course, if you are fused into the object, and I haven't watched the whole video, I was actually just listening to it and I decided to record this, but because it's not really a critique or anything, just a commentary. If you were kind of fused into the object, which of course would recursively condition the subject to, you know, reify objectivity, so you'd have this kind of almost, it would be basically probably the closest thing to a lack of free will, would be just this really concrete condition unto the soul that really treats its own object as, you know, principally true in itself. Well, that would be a kind of lack of foundation. It would be very unstable. It would be very it would have a lot of the same consequences that Trey is kind of getting at. And of course, I think Arval's explanation was very apt. But I think that the way I'm articulating here is fairly useful, because if you look at subject-object dynamics like this, it's a pretty useful way of understanding the relationship between mind and matter, or the unmanifest and the manifest, the immaterial and the material, in a monic way, you know, or a monistic way, rather than, you know, trying to you know, reconcile some duality. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.